Welcome to the Vortex Nation podcast, brought to you by lovers of hunting, shooting, public lands, the Second Amendment, and good food. Exciting new podcast lined up for you guys here. First focal plane versus second focal plane. It's a question we get all the time, whether from listeners, people on social media, on the phone. Now, a little behind the scenes for you guys here. This was actually our first recorded episode. Now, MC Ryan's informed me that this is going to be aired now as episode 9. So a little bit strange. You might hear us reference that first episode there in the recording. But actually, the reason being is because at the very end of this episode, if you stick around, we're going to mention an exciting brand new product. And actually, when we first recorded this, we thought it was going to be released a little bit sooner than it actually was. So after that slight delay, now we're able to release this for you guys. It's pretty exciting. So all the info here is still very solid. Like we said, first focal plane versus second focal plane. And then definitely stick around. You're going to hear some cool information on that brand new product. We're going to do our best at explaining something for you without being able to show it to you. It was a little bit new for us when we were first starting this podcast, but we had a lot of fun. Here we go, folks. Let us know what you think. Let's do it.
All right, everybody. Good afternoon. At least it's afternoon here where we are at the Vortex Optics headquarters in Barneville, Wisconsin. Coming at you with some very special guests from the Vortex office today. Going to talk about some riveting topics, but first, introductions. To my left, if you could see us, we've got Ryan Muckenhirn.
Good day. Good day, Vortex Nation.
Ryan, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Member of the Vortex Nation, here employed for approximately 3.5 years, coming up on 4 years. Been a Vortex fan for probably 8. Introduced the brand kind of the latter part of the 2000 and changes. Avid hunter, avid outdoorsman, love shooting, reloading, hiking, foraging, cooking things outside. Yeah.
Maybe that's why we're such good friends.
That could be.
A true man's man.
High probability.
Moving along, Jim Hamilton.
Howdy.
What's your story?
Member of the Vortex Nation since birth. I like
he was
this.
born into it.
I like this place quite a bit. Absolutely love Barneville. This is the coolest place ever. I really wish that every single one of you listeners could be out here to enjoy a little bit of this public that we get a nice view of out front across the parking lot right out here. And anyway, I enjoy shooting, getting into hunting. What I'm planning on is as much as I possibly can. I like to make Mark frustrated with the fact that I really want to go Western hunting as much as possible with a lever gun. It just
He's going to buck the norm.
right. Got to do it. But anyway, love weird guns too. I'm known around the office as Weird Gun Jim. So
Yeah, it does not frustrate me at all. I find it fascinating, as well as I respect your desire
to make life more difficult for myself.
To make life more difficult for yourself and take things on in a unique way.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll take that as a compliment.
It truly is. It truly is.
It's a good little niche to own. Yeah.
So yeah, well, that's me.
Paul Ness, everybody.
Hey, I have been around this place for about 22 years now, so a long stretch. My background comes mostly from big game hunting. Spent about 20 years as a licensed guide out in Idaho, and that led into a great career here at Vortex, talking about riflescopes and binos and spotters and getting everybody educated on how to use them. I like all the other stuff that goes along with that too, big in the camping and fishing and being outdoors. So I enjoy all of it.
Yeah. When Paul came here to Vortex, now granted, Paul's been here for 22 years, like you said, and that's just 1 year less than I've been alive. But when he first came here, I do know for a fact that everybody looked at Paul like he was John Wayne, or this day and age is John Wayne, because we were all so unfamiliar, a bunch of Wisconsinites, so unfamiliar with just somebody who was so deeply rooted out west. When he came in, everybody was like, oh my gosh, this guy is a cowboy.
Paul, I'll have you know.
I'll take that as a big compliment.
Yeah.
Paul, I'll have you know, I still look at you as John Wayne.
And as do I, but yeah. Now we're just more
Well,
used
that's
to
great.
Exactly. So
We've coined a term in the office that is, it's if something represents something very cool or it was a very adept way of doing something, it's very nice, as we call it.
so
nice.
so
nice.
so Nisi.
Cool did not cut it.
Yeah,
All right, guys. I think we better move along here.
Yeah,
to
all
the
right,
next
all right.
topic and
that's a very Nisi level
Humbleness.
of humbleness.
Yeah.
That's the word I was looking for.
Very nice.
Well, you know, and I made an assumption when we kicked this off, not to drag it along. I was remiss in introducing myself, Mark Boardman, Vortex Optics. Been here just a touch over 9 years at time of this recording. Lifelong hunter, lifelong fisherman. Born and raised Washington State, so I'm from the West Coast, and slowly migrated east. And love everything, big game hunting. Actually, all hunting. Big game, waterfowl, turkeys, predators, you name it. I like
Squirrels.
to chase it. Squirrels. And I guess likewise with fishing. So kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to that stuff. And love optics, love Vortex. And
now hosting the podcast, the Vortex Nation podcast, where we're going to talk about something we get asked a lot about here. Mark?
absolutely. So, Jim, you bring up the topic of the day. And to your point, something that comes up quite a bit. Lots of customer questions, lots of emails. You see it come up on forums at times. First focal plane rifle scopes versus second focal plane rifle scopes. Which one is better? What are they for? How do they work? Interesting topic. A topic we're pretty familiar with here at Vortex. And
Yeah, and if you stick around, we'll mention something kind of interesting, too, at the end of this as well, depending on when this is aired. But, yeah.
perfect tease, Jim.
Perfect. Well, thank you. But, yeah, so I'll just chime in here real fast. First focal plane, second focal plane. I think the biggest thing, so working in social media here, and I'm sure that Ryan and Paul can attest to this as well, because Ryan and Paul have been answering phones for quite a long time here as well, helping people out. You know, we get asked just, I think before we go into like why you would want first focal plane or second focal plane, just what is the difference? Oftentimes you'll see SFP or FFP. That's what we're also referring to. So the first focal plane and second focal plane, Paul is actually really good at describing. I think he was the first person who ever taught me what the difference was. So what do you think?
yeah, we can hit on that. The first thing I'd point out to people is that when we use the word plane inside the scope, what we're sort of referring to is a flat plane, like you might almost think of it as a pane of glass that slides in the scope. And essentially, in these rifle scopes, there are 2 points where a reticle can be placed inside the scope to work and give you an image. And that is referred to as the first focal plane and the second focal plane. Now, we've all got a rifle scope here right in front of us to look at, which makes it easy. But I can describe it to the viewers and the listeners out here is that when you have first focal plane, that sort of sits right underneath the turrets of the rifle scope. And the second focal plane sits back underneath about where the magnification ring is on your scope. And I think most people can visualize that pretty easily when you think about it. But the key thing is, in between those 2 planes, you have an inner component of that rifle scope called the erector tube. And that's a small tube that's within a tube, and it's how when you adjust the turrets on your scope, you make your left and right and up and down corrections. But that erector tube in there also houses the small lenses that run your zoom mechanism, which makes the image get bigger or smaller as you turn that magnification lever. And so what happens, you can put the reticle in the scope at one end or the other of that zoom mechanism. Now, if we have the reticle at the end that's underneath the turrets, it's out in front of the zooming lenses. If we have, on the other hand, the reticle's on the back end of the scope and it's back underneath the magnification lever, now it's on the end of the zoom lenses where that image is being zoomed up or down. And so the end result to you as the viewer when you look at that scope is if you have first focal plane and you run the magnification lever, you will see that the image of the reticle grows and shrinks right along with the image of the target. If it's a second focal plane that's backed by the magnification lever, that reticle always looks the same size. It's on the other side of those zooming lenses. It's not being affected by the zooming lenses. And so now what you have is the reticle looks the same, stays the same size to your eye, but the target object, the target or the elk or the deer that you might be shooting at, that object is getting bigger or smaller. So it's very quick. You can determine very quickly in a rifle scope, looking at it and running the magnification lever if you have first or second focal plane. And I think what we'll get into talking about here now is why is one advantageous over another? What makes one better? What works good about one and doesn't work about another?
Right. And so, I think a lot of times we hear people, first focal plane kind of has this stigma about it. And I think I really can't put my finger on why it is. I think it's maybe usually all things similar. First focal plane scope is a little bit more expensive than a second focal plane scope. So, and oftentimes people like to put numbers to things to make it seem better or worse or compare it in some other fashion. And so if they see all else is similar, but one is more expensive than the other, and it says FFP at the end, well, then that one must be better. And I've seen that a lot, and a lot of people saying, I need first focal plane, but maybe not always.
They don't always know why.
But just somebody told them that, hey, it'd be a really good idea for you. And certainly it is advantageous. Like we said, we're going to get into some of these as to why you might want first focal plane, but you don't always need it. Sometimes second focal plane gets you by just fine. You can save a little money for ammo too.
Well, and sometimes second focal plane is the better option.
True.
Depending on the application.
Yeah. And Paul, actually, you brought up a good point too. So when you're talking about the reticle, I guess this is just another way. Sometimes for some people, it just clicks a slightly different way for you when you think about this. But the first focal plane, if you think about it, there's almost, and Paul, you can correct me if I'm going off on tangent here, but there's almost like two images that you're seeing when you look through a rifle scope. And one of them is the image of a reticle, and one of them is the image of whatever you're looking at. And those two images meet up together with one another, and that reticle you're overlaying over the image of what you're looking at with the rifle scope. Without a reticle in there, you basically just have a spotting scope mounted to your gun, And so, but you see
It'd be
those
pretty hard to hit stuff.
Yeah. You see those two images in there, and like Paul said, if those two images are meeting up together one another before it goes through all the zoom lenses, then they're both going to move with one another after they go through all the zooming process, essentially. But if they don't meet up with one another until after the image has been zoomed and gone through all of its process in the erector unit, they don't meet up until after that, well, then the reticle won't go through all that with the image. It only just meets up at the end. So just another way of thinking about it sometimes, and, that might click with people. But, Ryan, what do you think about as far as, first focal plane? That's obviously like the big one. What are like some scenarios, or I guess just anybody, what are some scenarios where people are going to need or prefer first focal plane?
Well, great question. I think looking at like a tactical rifle scope, especially stuff where we start getting higher magnifications, first focal plane has an inherent advantage. As we touched on earlier, having the ability to retain your subtension values without changing throughout the magnification range, or being able to use your reticle, I should say, at any magnification without having to worry about any additional math or holdover or anything, I think for the, like, say, a police marksman or a military marksman would be paramount. If you can imagine having a 25 power rifle scope and having to take a shot at, say, 64 yards, you're probably not going to run your optic all the way up. But if we could come up with some foreseeable instance in which we would need to use a subtension holdover on the reticle, I think it would be, behoove the shooter to run a first focal plane. In a hunting scenario,
reticle comes into play actually a lot. Sorry to interrupt, but one thing I don't know if we fully mentioned too is your reticle will come into play here. Reticles, for so many people, it's essentially like a ruler inside your scope.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I sometimes think of it, like first focal plane, you're always changing the scale. Whenever you change the scale of an image with your zoom, if you want that reticle with its hash marks on it, which, hash marks, subtensions, things like that, kind of the same thing we're talking about. If you want those subtensions to stay true in relation to the size of your image, a deer, whatever size it is, or let's just say for simplicity's sake, if something is 100 inches, well, you want your measurements on that reticle with the hash marks to correlate properly to that. And so if you grow that image and you shrink that image with your magnification, if your reticle doesn't also grow and shrink with it, then it's losing its correlation with the
Right,
size
right.
of that.
Yeah, it does. I mean, when you think of the advantages of first focal plane, it really does boil down to the reticle. You can imagine if we had a very simple wire crosshair in there, there would be no real advantage to first versus second focal plane. So it all comes down to when you want to use that reticle, and you're going to, just like Jim said, if you want to use those marks to gauge holdovers and wind drifts and that sort of thing, all of a sudden that first focal plane becomes very advantageous. Now those marks stay constant all the way through the mag range.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and Ryan even touched on one thing too, where he mentioned, if you're taking a shot with a 5 to 25 or a 3 to 15 or something, relatively larger magnification like that, and something comes out at 50 yards, you're probably not going to run it. You mentioned all the way up. And so when we refer to all the way up, what we're referring to is the fact that second focal plane reticles, some people worry about, second focal plane reticles because there's usually only one magnification that if you have a reticle that has hash marks on it, or that ruler, if you will, there's usually one magnification the whole range that it correlates properly with the image size. So the image size is at the right proportion to the reticle hash marks that you can use it for ranging, subtensions, holdovers, things like that.
Exactly.
And so oftentimes it's at the very high end of the magnification range. So that's why if something jumps out at 50, you're probably not going to want to go all the way up to 25 power or 20 power or something like that to then get the range or a holdover or something like that. So that's what he's also referring to there.
And that's an extreme scenario in some ways
Right,
as
it
well.
is.
Just
It is.
we're using like extreme numbers with that 50 yards because you're not going to be doing too much holdover work at 50,
right.
Very true.
I can give you guys a prime example of why that's advantageous. And I'll quickly throw out first focal plane for hunters has been a little slow to be adapted. It's definitely taken off much harder in the tactical and long range and sniper communities. It's definitely gaining awareness in the hunting community. So, and here's a great example of why it makes a big difference. I had a fellow one year, I was guiding on a sheep hunt, and we had a long all-day stalk to get to a position to shoot a ram. And we had gone down through a deep canyon and come up, and we were on a very sharp rock edge. And I knew as soon as we crested that rock edge that we were going to be in shooting distance of these rams, and potentially very close, within 100 yards, 150 yards. And so I had the guy that I was with run his scope down to about 4x in case we popped over the ridge and he was going to have to shoot very quickly at a ram below us. Well, lo and behold, we crested over the ridge, and the rams had already heard us or gotten wind of us, and they were trotting out of this valley on the far side already, going away, and they were 300 yards away. And this all happened, you can imagine, just in seconds. There was no time to think. It was get a pack down and get ready to shoot. And I was calling ranges for the guy shooting, and I would call a range and I'd shoot, and he immediately went over the top. And now the rams are moving faster and out of this basin. And that went on 3 times, called shots, and each time he was going well over the top of the rams. And this all, it was all said and done in just a few minutes. And afterwards, clean miss. The rams were gone, and we're scratching our heads trying to figure it out. And it only took a few minutes to realize, and he was shooting a scope that had a BDC-style reticle in it. So he had holdover marks on his reticle that he was using to shoot at. And as I called ranges for the guy, he was using the appropriate mark on the reticle and shooting. But he kept going over the top. Well, as soon as we looked at it afterwards and realized what had happened is the scope was keyed for about 12x, just as Jim was talking about, to make those reticle marks work. And he was shooting at 4x, which is what we had set the scope to as we crested over the ridge. And so what that means is that difference between 4x and 12x made him shoot over the top of those rams every time, way
Right.
over the top of them.
Right.
And it was that case where if that scope had been first focal plane, it wouldn't have mattered whether he was at 4x or 12x. He would have been right on the money. So that's it's a great example of where that big advantage lies for first focal plane.
I mean, it's a good example, and in a situation like that, if you plan on using the holdovers in your reticle in a situation like that, and really any high stress scenario where maybe adrenaline's going or your heart rate, so that could be a hunting situation or competition shooting situation or what have you. But that first focal plane can be a fail-safe measure. You don't necessarily have to be
Right.
cognizant of where
Right.
your scope is at in the zoom range. And then on the flip side, you don't always want to be maxed out all the
Right,
time.
right.
There's a lot of situations where you want to take advantage of the lower end of your zoom range, be it maybe there's atmospherics going on, maybe there's a lot of heat waves or mirage, maybe it's a low light scenario.
You want a wider field of view.
You want a wider field of view. You want to. So there's just a lot of situations where you may not want to be topped out on your zoom range, but you still want to use those subtension markings or graduations, or even for lack of a better term, the data that's available in some of these more complex reticles that are can be highly usable if you if you know how to use them. And actually, I'll bring up one other point. We're talking about the reticles and using the subtensions and the different markings for your holdovers. All that is contingent upon a person going through the process of getting accurate ballistic data for the load that they're pushing through that particular rifle. It's not a one-size-fits-all. I mean, you got to put in some work on the front end.
That is very true. Ryan, I know you're big into chronographing.
Yeah.
A lot when you're sighting in. Then maybe this can be a brief tangent, real fast, just to plug just actually getting your data, because no matter what reticle you're using, if you're using second focal plane, if you're using first focal plane, even just with a second focal plane duplex reticle, if you ever have to dial that thing, you need to know what to dial in it. And really, a reticle, when we talk about holding over or dialing your turrets, it's two means of doing the same thing.
Exactly.
Either way, if you dial your turrets, you move your reticle physically inside the rifle scope, and thus it makes you move your whole rifle, thus moving your barrel in a different position to have that bullet end up in a different place. And if you just use holdovers without dialing, you're moving your barrel, your whole rifle, to get the holdovers, those hash marks, onto onto an animal, a target, whatever it might be. And so all that we're trying to do with rifle scopes is essentially then move your barrel. And so if you don't have good data going in, you won't know what to dial, what to hold over. Ryan, what do you recommend there?
Great question. So here's another real life example. Our local gun range here, we're at an elevation of about 864 feet above sea level at the shooting bench on the 500 meter range. And so if I chronograph my hunting rifle, and I did this before I went to Wyoming this year, chronographed my hunting rifle, I got that data, ran it through the ballistic calculator, and came up with a drop chart and validated it out to distance at that particular level, at that 864 feet above sea level. When I went out to Wyoming for an antelope hunt, we re-chronoed and checked everybody's guns, and we found at 1,000 yards, and granted, that's farther than I'd ever engage a game animal under any circumstance. At 1,000 yards, there was a 1 milliradian discrepancy, and that equates to 36 inches of error. So huge. I mean, it would have been a total miss on anything that I would have been hunting. A mill at 1,000 yards is a ton. So, obviously that discrepancy in elevation or atmospherics can weigh in immensely on how your reticle is going to behave, or where your holdover points are going to be, your dial points. So it is important to gather accurate data, to take into consideration things like elevation changes, or even temperature swings, because it can be, very impactful to what you can put into your scope. Touching on the hunting thing with first focal plane a little bit, we see at a lot of these shows that we're going to, like the Western Hunting and Conservation Expo out in Salt Lake City, the long-range hunting, movement is really coming along. We're starting to see a lot more high-powered rifle scopes being utilized for that. We're seeing crossovers from tactical rifle scopes now into the hunting market because of their expanded capabilities. And one argument for the first focal plane, why you would use it in a situation like that, is not often will you find yourself being able to run at high magnification. And I think about, the past 20 big game animals that I've taken across the country, and they haven't been exceptionally far, but most of them have been, in the morning hours or in the evening hours where light is at a premium. And if I was running something like, say, a 5 to 25 PST Gen 2, at 25 power, I'd be at somewhat of a disadvantage for light, have to dial the optic back to, say, 10, 12 in order to have adequate light to see the target and make an ethical shot. If it was a second focal plane and I wasn't going to rely on the turret, to make that shot, we would end up just like Paul's guy did and over the back of that critter. So the first focal plane would completely negate any problem that might be there using the reticle, which is really quite handy, especially when hunting or shooting with a high magnification rifle scope. I think overall the benefits far outweigh any negative that might be present in that scenario.
Yeah. Well, we've talked a fair bit about hunting here. Actually, first focal plane can have a really great impact on hunting to both your guys' points. Now, one of the other big areas where first focal plane has become very popular, I'd say, I don't know if it's started. I can't attest to it starting with this, but you talk about PRS competition shooters and a lot of the other long range competition shooters. And actually, Mark, you kind of mentioned this earlier. High stress, oftentimes, in that case, you're on the clock. But if it's a tactical, duty scenario, you're on a different type of clock, if you will. Those kind of environments where you don't always have the time to figure out what magnification you're on, dial your turrets even. Those seem to be...
Right. It comes back to that key thing of not being locked into a single magnification that makes all those subtensions work. First focal planes, you can be on any magnification. And the example I gave was a little bit extreme. It went from 4x to 12x. But what happens in a second focal plane scope, you have to remember, you don't have to be anywhere near that extreme. If you're even, let's say your scope is calibrated at 12x, and that's what it's set up to make all those subtensions work right. Even if you've bumped that mag lever a little bit, even if you've bumped that down to 11x, and maybe you were aware that it should be at 12, but you've just turned it, you've rubbed it on your coat or your pack or something, even that's going to be enough if you use those subtension marks to throw your shot off. It might not be an extreme difference, but every time you're off of that mag setting, you do affect that shot.
To what you were talking about a little bit there, Jim, with and this is my background is predominantly Western hunting background, so I'm gleaning this off of probably more just talking with guys that are competition shooters or PRS shooters, or really any scenario where you're going to have to engage multiple targets in rapid succession, and you kind of talked to that with the time factor, not needing to change your magnification, not needing to dial your turret, and be anywhere within that zoom range and use the subtension markings and the wind holds in your reticle. If somebody's calling out, okay, 550, and that hold, bam, and 0.2 seconds later you're trying to rip another target at 800 yards, you can do that all very quickly if you're, with the practice, and if you're well versed in using that system, you can engage those targets and be effective, in a very quick manner.
Very valuable for those guys, obviously. Yeah.
And with practice, we've all seen around here, not just our shooters or, guys at this office, but also other guys out there shooting, that you can make very accurate shots at some pretty extreme distances, not on your maximum magnification.
Absolutely.
I mean, you talk about a 5-25 PST, that one's come up a couple times, or a 4.5-27 Razor Gen 2, even a 6-24 HSLR. You can, on 10 power, get to $1,000 quite easily. I mean,
absolutely.
It's sure, if you're trying to shoot groups at 1,000 on a piece of paper, yeah, maybe you'll want to bump it up. But in the case of shooting steel targets or something like that, that middle power setting is actually very usable. I mean, heck, Ryan Muckenhirn here shot out to 1,000 with a 9 power Diamondback Tactical. You can do a lot with that. Sometimes people almost treat their optics, I think, when you get a variable power optic. Let's say it's a 5-25, 3-15, whatever it is. Some people treat it as a 3 or 15, 5 or 25, and they forget that there's quite a few 20 levels of magnification in there, or something along those lines, and they're actually very usable.
Yeah, and of course we're all very familiar with it, but for people who haven't spent a lot of time behind a rifle scope, in view of what Jimmy's saying, the other thing you find out is a lot of times the scopes are friendlier to get your eye behind at less magnification than full. You'll just find you pick up that sight picture a lot quicker. It's brighter. It may seem wider to field of view. It just makes it a lot of times more pleasant to get behind the scope when you're not all the way up there.
Yep. I know when we were at the Vortex Extreme the last time, we were shooting at 1,200 and, banging away for quite some time. And I looked down and just very naturally, just, looking at different targets and acquisition and just what was comfortable for me, I was shooting a 4.5-27, but I was consistently right about that 18 power range.
Mm-hmm. You can find things so much easier,
and
too.
that was a big part of it.
I mean, out there at the Vortex Extreme, there's so much sagebrush that oftentimes a guy's like, yeah, you got a target at 300, and you're like, dude, you could have told me I had a target right in front of my face, and I wouldn't have been able to find it. And bumping that down sometimes a little bit just gives you a little bit more scanning ability. But
Absolutely.
it seems like, and we've been talking about first focal plane here a lot, and we'll get into second focal plane. It'd be interesting to hear what we have to say about second focal plane too, because we've hyped up first focal plane so much. But it seems to me like, from what Ryan, Paul, Mark, you guys have said, first focal plane is something that primarily the guys who want to use their reticle a lot, that's the kind of customer that is going to want to get first focal plane. Is that
I'm gonna throw a caveat into that.
Throw it in
because
there.
Because predominantly how I use a first focal plane reticle is generally in scenarios, and it doesn't have to be hunting. It just generally falls in that for me. If I'm on a hunt and it's an open landscape where I anticipate having longer distance shots, I'm going to be using a rifle scope like the Viper HSLR, which is a 6-24 by 50 first focal plane. Generally in those scenarios, if I get a longer range shot, I have the time to dial my turret. But I still, if I'm with somebody or even just myself and I want to, gauge the wind, or somebody says, "Hey, hold this amount of wind," I prefer to dial my turret all day long so I can hold dead on, but I'll hold that wind off the reticle, and that first focal plane optical system allows me to hold accurate wind anywhere within the zoom range as well.
That's
That's
fair.
true.
I bet it also helps for follow-up shots too.
Yeah. One thing I think would be at this point good to point out to the listeners is that when you dial the turret as opposed to using the reticle, is that the turret is not sensitive to magnification, whether or not you have first or second focal plane. And that's what Mark was kind of alluding to. So what happens there is the shooter, you don't have to worry about being at a particular magnification when you dial your turret as opposed to using that reticle.
Yeah. You're using the center reticle.
Yeah, you're using the center of the reticle and you're making that adjustment with the turret. So it doesn't care what magnification you're on. But as Mark pointed out, the thing that guys forget is that most shooters, rather than dialing the wind on the turret, they prefer to hold for wind using that reticle. Whether you dial or you use the turret for elevation, almost everybody holds for wind using the reticle. Wind corrections are dynamic. It's something that you're constantly making little changes to where you hold depending on what you feel the wind is. A lot of times dialing a turret for wind is just not very handy to do in the field. And so there's where the rub comes in. You can dial that elevation on the turret, but when you're going to hold for wind and you're going to use those marks on the reticle to gauge your wind, now we're back to that same advantage of the first focal plane in that it doesn't care what magnification you're at. So even with the turrets, that's it's a plus having that.
It's good stuff. By the time people are done listening to this podcast, our second focal plane sales will drop off the face of the cliff. No, just kidding. But it does. Actually, that's a really good point you brought up there, Paul, too. And as we segue a little bit into second focal plane, one thing that we get on social media a lot, people ask about first focal plane, second focal plane, and we'll get into this. There are times where you don't need first focal plane. You can actually get by just fine with second focal plane. But a lot of times people ask, hey, I really want to get XYZ and I want to get it in first focal plane. And, sometimes I ask people, well, what is it about first focal plane that you really want? And sometimes they present a perfectly valid argument for why they want first focal plane. It's okay, cool. Let's help you find that. But sometimes they say, well, it just seems like I can only shoot it on the highest magnification. And what Paul was getting at is, oh no, you can shoot it on, any magnification if you're dialing and shooting off the center crosshair. It's not that it's not that it's unusable on any other magnification. It's just that you're going to want to dial and shoot off your center crosshair on those other magnifications. And then once you make it to that predetermined magnification level, then you start opening up some more possibilities to use your reticle or something along those lines. But what do you guys think about second focal plane, though? When would...
I will say this. Of the probably 30 or 40 rifle scopes I own, the enormous majority are second focal plane. And I would like to say that I fancy myself somewhat of a fancy shooter, and so you would think first focal plane would be it. But really, most of my rifle scopes are on hunting rifles. So I'm in low magnification ranges from 1 to 6, 1.5 to 8, or 2.5 to 8, or 2.5 to 10, things like that, the 3 to 9, the classic rifle scope for a hunting application traditionally will be second focal plane versus first focal plane. So I wouldn't say I necessarily prefer first focal plane, but I can make an argument towards it, I think, for a wider swath of application and use, being hassle-free for the user. But like, I'm from central Minnesota, and so we hunt in shotgun and muzzleloader country. You can't use a high-powered centerfire rifle. And so I use a Browning A-Bolt 12-gauge, really a neat gun. And I've got a Viper HS 2.5 to 10 on it. And
It's a man's rifle.
yeah, that's right. And I was thinking a deer that I had taken in 2015 or 2016, I had gone up to do a follow-up shot on it, and it was relatively tight country and close quarters. And I turned my optic back to 2.5, and I actually jumped the animal and was able to make a quick snapshot at about 40 yards, and finish it off. Had I been using a first focal plane, like an equivalent optic in that scenario, my reticle would have been so small that I would have had to have been dependent on illumination, or I just wouldn't have been able to see my reticle. So the second focal plane in that scenario, I think, is probably a better choice. I'm not going to tell the guy who hunts heavily wooded country or things like that he has to have a first focal plane, especially when he's running a lower magnification rifle scope or something, say, under 12 or so. I just don't find it necessary for most hunting applications. And that's where I think second focal plane lends itself so useful and still very popular is the majority of the hunting crowd, and even Western states. Like, I've used the Viper HS 2.5 to 10 on any number of Western hunts and for species like antelope and mule deer and Western whitetails, and never an issue. It's not like that. But, for a no-nonsense rifle scope that, as long as you're mindful of where you're at in your magnification range, it's going to accomplish everything you need it to, using your reticle, and you shouldn't have anything to worry about. So,
Yeah,
Right.
at those short distances, usually you're not holding over.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's one thing you brought up, I think, that a lot of people don't always consider, is that with the first focal plane, in order to get that hassle-free, quote-unquote, ability to use it when the reticle grows and shrinks with the image, the reticle is growing and shrinking with the image. And so, like you said, when it shrinks down with that smaller image, it's pretty tiny.
Oh, yeah.
And if you don't have your illumination on, or you don't have time to fiddle with that, or just you don't have illumination, that can be pretty tough to pick up.
Right.
It's not.
It's exactly right. What happens is in those scopes is you lose some ability at the low end of the magnification range in low light to see the reticle. Yeah, and I think Ryan's points were very valid, and I think that probably meshes up with a big chunk of the hunting community out there. In that, most everyone has grown up using second focal plane scopes, and many times they work absolutely fine. The drawback to the first focal planes is seeing that reticle. They're a little more keyed with long range precision type shooting, and they don't necessarily work really well with that short range fast stuff. Many of the first focal plane scopes do use an illumination knob, and that's where that really comes into play, is being able to see that reticle at the lowest power when it's a very fine little crosshair in your field of view. But when you can light it up and illuminate it, then it becomes a little more usable.
Yeah. And you think about when you might be at those lower mags, right? In the early morning hours, in the evening hours, when you kind of have that waning light where, it can become, it's just tougher viewing conditions in general, no matter what optic you're using, right? But then you start, in essence, shrinking that reticle. Not only are the subtensions to become, less usable, or not less usable, but
almost invisible though.
Right.
Yeah.
It's just hard to see. To me, because I use both, and to me, it's like application specific, totally, and maybe even more anticipated distance of shot specific.
That's a big factor.
I spent 9 hours talking about the advantages of first focal plane, right? But that's all, I guess, under the, or at least, as I'm talking about it, I'm thinking of terms of an extremely high likelihood that the bulk of my shots are going to take place at longer distances.
Right. Higher magnification, relatively higher magnification. Doesn't always have to be the max, but
exactly. Then you get into scenarios, whether it's just a landscape, hunting landscape, possibly urban landscape. To me, it becomes not to me, the second focal plane optical system then is actually going to shine.
Yeah. Oh, certainly. Definitely. No, and I agree with that. If I'm going to hunt with a first focal plane rifle scope, it's going to be in a place where I am going to be anticipating taking we'll call it a more technical shot, or I may need every advantage with reticle that I can get. If it's going to be, again, where Mark and I hunt northern Missouri or back home in Minnesota or even here in Wisconsin, it's just, I don't think that it's a requirement. I don't think it's a necessity. And I think it can actually be a hindrance using a first focal plane like that. So, yeah, definitely application-based, suit the optic for the task at hand.
And for the casual range goer, so, we mentioned a lot about hunting here, but I'll pitch in on the casual range goer too. So I've actually found that as I've gotten into the sport of shooting, even if I'm going out, more long range shooting at the range, that as I'm starting out, second focal plane is a nice thing to start with. Not just because it's actually usually, again, all things similar. It's usually less expensive than the first focal plane option. So there's a plus.
Well, that's
to it.
That's one of the other big advantages.
Right. Yeah.
We do need to point out that there's always a cost benefit with second focal plane.
Yeah, I'd be curious too, Paul. You could speak to it too. The reason as to why first focal plane is usually more expensive, but regarding the newer shooters, just casual range goers, again, long range guys, even if you're just getting started, it's not bad to go second focal plane because again, that's where you're going to be relying on your turrets a lot. And if you can understand, once you get into shooting, if you can understand your turrets, you have figured out a lot. And because it is complex when you first get into things. You're trying to account for shooting a tiny little rock, significant distances, and hitting a plate usually no bigger than your torso. And to be able to learn your dope, your data on previous engagements, and understand how that works from your zero, and then dial your turrets. Once you understand how all that works, I'm dialing X MOA or X MRAD. Once you understand how all that works, then your reticle is doing the same thing. You just don't have to dial your turrets anymore. It's a little bit quicker if you use a first focal plane. So almost, I recommend to a lot of guys if they're starting out, why don't we get second focal plane, learn how to use your turrets, and then when you get a first focal plane optic, now you understand both how to use your turrets and how to understand measurements, MOA and MRAD, bullet drop, and you can use that thing to its full advantage.
No, and there's some people that never plan or intend to go through the process of getting that ballistic data.
Mm-hmm.
So for that guy or person, it's almost becomes a moot point unless.
And why would you even get first focal plane?
I'd say the only reason would be that maybe a specific rifle scope offered an additional set of features.
Right.
That they wanted, perhaps, but
right.
But the first or second becomes a moot point because you need to have that information to make.
Yeah, you have to have kind of a grasp of what MOAs are and what MRADs are and what validating a drop curve is. And there are a lot of things that go into that to really understanding it and being able to take full advantage of using the turret or using those marks on the reticle. It takes a little bit of homework on the shooter's part.
Right. But why? Okay, so Paul, you've worked with product development quite often. Why is first focal plane oftentimes the more expensive option?
It almost always is more expensive. Although I'll say it's generally if let's say you have a scope and it's at a given quality price point with the features and the glass and the mechanicals. It's generally not a gigantic difference. I think what we see is many times in some of our scope series, it's been maybe $100, maybe $150 difference. I think where it really comes down to is simply the cost of the reticle itself. When you remember we talked about the reticles being located fore and aft of those magnifying lenses inside the erector tube in there. The second focal plane reticles, which are backed by your eyepiece, those are physically a larger reticle. You can actually, you can hold the plate that's on. It's sort of about the size of a nickel in there. And you can, you can literally look at that crosshair and you can see it in there. It's something that's pretty large and visible. And generally fairly simple designs. You don't see really elaborate designs on the second focal plane reticles. Conversely, when we look at the first focal plane, they're out in front of all those magnifying lenses. And so what happens is the reticle itself is a much fancier sort of mechanism. It's a small plate of glass. They're always etched on glass. They're not a simple wire or foil style reticle. So they're a glass etch design, which is typically sandwiched between two layers of glass. They're very small. If you were to pick one of those up, you can barely see that reticle image to the eye. It's teensy tiny in there. It's faint. You almost need a magnifying glass to look at it and see it. So I think you can envision that by its nature, it's a more expensive part to manufacture and build. So that's where part of the cost is. And I think the other part of that cost is in the fact that the alignment and assembly on those first focal plane reticles is much, much touchier.
It's much deeper inside the tube.
It's deeper inside. There's a higher level of precision that has to be used in installing that reticle.
Yeah, because if you got angry at your rifle scope and really wrenched that thing, you could take the eyepiece off. And when you get to that, then a second focal plane reticle is right there.
It's right there in front of you.
And you can make those adjustments on the fly, I'm
Yeah.
sure, when you're manufacturing it. Granted, I've never built one from the ground up, of course, but I'd imagine in a first focal plane, you got to put the whole thing together, and it's not until it's all together that you can see if there's even just the tiniest misalignment or whatever, and then you got to take the whole
or
thing.
installed off center or
Right,
something
right.
like that. So yeah, there's more cost and time and effort that goes into putting them together.
Right, and it seems like, most of the time you're finding first focal plane in those kind of more upper echelon pieces. Like we started, for example, with I think was our first focal plane the Razor 5-20
Was our Gen 1 Razor,
Right.
which is a very nice heavy duty tactical rifle scope, very high quality.
Still in the lineup today.
Still there.
Because of those reasons.
still around, despite the fact that there's a Gen 2 Razor. But then we've also got, of course, the PST series in first focal plane. And my subtle segue here into there's the Viper HSLR, which can't be forgotten. Great first focal plane optic, kind of a do-it-all optic.
Long range
really.
hunting
Yeah.
gets used a lot for it.
Yeah, but then below that, we haven't had anything until, and depending on when this gets aired, we don't know exactly when it'll get aired, but a new product, the Diamondback Tactical First Focal Plane. I wish there was a drum roll. Maybe Ryan Van here. There's two Ryans. Ryan Van, the master MC, can get a little drum roll going. But guys, the Diamondback Tactical First Focal Plane. That series started with just a 3-9 and a 4-12 second focal plane optic that tracks like anything else.
Turrets, really
Great
nice
turrets.
Yeah.
Awesome optical system, and Ryan Muckenhirn shot it out to 1,000 yards with a 3-9 on a Ruger American, a setup that you can do for less than $1,000. And now, at a crazy good price point, I don't even know if we have it fully locked in now at the time when we're recording this, but more of an entry-level first focal plane optic. Guys, so why is this so exciting if I haven't already hyped it up enough?
Well, it's gonna put the capabilities of the first focal plane optic into the shooter's hands that cannot or will not afford $1,000 plus. This is really pretty cool, and it's almost a really neat coincidence that this comes along now, where we have like the new NRL 22 league and the precision rifle leagues for 22 long rifle coming too, because now it's this is bread and butter.
That and you've got guys getting into the gas gun PRS too, wanting to do those with first focal plane optics. So I guess we didn't even mention any of the specs, but we probably should. So we've got a 4-16 by 50.
I think it's a 44.
44.
I think
4-16 by 44,
yeah.
and a 6-24 by 50, both first focal plane. And you've got I've looked through these things. The optics seem excellent. You've got which reticle is in there?
EBR2C. Or EBR4, excuse me.
EBR4s.
Yep.
EBR4s, right. So this is essentially it's a hash mark style reticle. It does not use the Christmas tree pattern though. So you have nice toll over marks for wind and bullet drop.
Quite a lot of information in there.
It is. It's really a nice reticle.
So, and then you've got those. You've got tall, exposed turrets. Yeah, available in MOA or MRAD.
Yeah,
and it's a side parallax adjustment knob. So one of our first podcasts, we're doing our best at explaining something without you being able to see it. That's interesting, but it's truly exciting.
The scope is scope shaped, so if you want to visualize that, folks,
it has an objective.
Did we mention black?
it is a black scope.
It is a black scope.
Very attractive looking package.
It is.
So really nice. Great turret feel on them. Very smooth, precise turning turrets. What do we got for what's our rotation amount there, Ryan?
Per revolution, 15 MOA, which is really cool. That's actually pretty dense turret for this kind of thing. I mean, when you get to the PST Gen 2 line and some of the Razor lines, you're going to get a little higher turret density, but 15 MOA per revolution is pretty awesome. You know, we were 10 MOA or 12 MOA, I guess, for a while, and that's that's really stepping it up. This is going to be a great optic for the guy or gal who wants to get into that PRS or that NRL or NRL 22 or PRS 22 league, or for the shooter that does want to reap the benefits of first focal plane without having to really step up to that price point, that $1,000 plus price point. And I was lucky enough to get to fire some of the original test prototypes, and this was some time ago, and not knowing exactly what they were when they had rolled off the prototype line and getting them on the rifle, I was very, very pleasantly surprised optically and mechanically with what this was. And I had all the speculation in the world as to what it could have been. And, you know, when we started talking about, hey, this is going to be an entry into the Diamondback tactical line, it's like, well, that is a smoking deal.
Yeah.
So, you know, look out, Shooting World. This is going to be a pretty cool one.
Oh, we didn't mention either 30 mil tube.
Yeah. Yep.
Which is one thing that people asked for in the original Diamondback Tactical. Still actually quite a bit of travel in that original Diamondback Tactical, just the 1-inch tube. And now we get a 30 mil tube with this first focal plane model. And yeah, I mean, you could still, realistically speaking, with the prices that, again, like I said, I'm not sure we're 100% locked in, but I know we're just about there at the time of this recording. But you could probably still do with the right rifle. Hence, we did it with a Ruger American with the old Diamondback Tactical. Good set of our pro rings. You could probably still do 1,000 yards plus, certainly plus, for less than $1,000 with this too.
Yeah, I think you're going to be right in there. Yeah.
So very, very exciting.
I mean, an extremely just feature-rich, highly functional rifle scope. You know, the zoom ranges, you know, with the 4-16 and the 6-24, extremely versatile. Man, for a person wanting to get into that style of shooting, but doesn't have a monster budget, like I'd say most of us don't, you know, or a lot of people don't. I think it's just poised to be a hit with folks.
Right. Well, it just, you know, it's going to, as Ryan touched on earlier, it's going to bring that first focal plane scope into reach for a lot of guys that just maybe couldn't afford it previously.
Yeah,
so.
for so long too. Like you mentioned, the Viper HSLR, that one goes for around $800 to $900, I think.
$949 for the
okay, $950. Yep. So I was a little bit off, but you know that has been like as close to our entry into first focal plane as you could get. And you alluded to the fact it's kind of more set up for long range Western hunting.
It's been very popular for that.
It's a very good scope for that, and it has the exposed elevation turret. For those of you not familiar, exposed elevation turret, capped windage, so you don't bump it around too much in the brush while you're carrying around out there. MOA only.
Correct.
6-24. Correct. And, you know, that scope, like $950, we understand that's not pocket change for anybody. And really, even as is, it's not like your perfect target shooting, range going, tactical style. It's not an ideal scope for that. It can do it, but this optic here, for a significantly more entry-level price, can actually do probably more of that type of shooting, recreational, tactical, range going, just all that kind of stuff in first focal plane. It can actually probably do it better than the HSLR can, you know, and, you know, you could do Western hunting with it as well, but then, you know, then you might start looking at the HSLR. It might be a little bit better at that. So there's trade-offs, but you get an optic more well suited for those types of applications with this. So
yeah, I could definitely see a lot of crossover with this one for sure.
Mm-hmm. Dimensionally, it's well suited for a hunting rifle, like usable power range and size weight. It is. It's a pleasing little package
for sure.
Yeah, nicely scaled turrets on it. They're not tremendously tall. I think they're just a good dimension. They're easy to grasp and turn, but they don't stick way up in the air either. So they'll be appealing to a lot of guys.
Yeah, it's a pretty sleek package for sure.
Sweet. So that, again, like we said, we're not exactly sure when this will air, but we're hoping to air sometime around the time that these are released, and so it'll be still pretty fresh for everybody. But what do you say? Do you think we get into? We covered a lot for first focal plane, second focal plane. Do we get into our last call here, Mark?
I think we're ready.
I think we're ready. There's probably something that we missed. The biggest thing here with this podcast, folks, the listeners, this is just this. If you have any questions at all, please let us know. or if there's anything we missed, didn't cover, one thing, I can already think of something I'm going to mention in my last call that we didn't cover because it's its own podcast. But, yeah, so Ryan, Paul, we're going to do like a last call thing, like final thoughts about this whole thing. But what do you say?
All right.
Paul?
All right. Well, I think if nothing else, if this has explained the mysteries of first focal plane a little bit to guys that maybe have heard that term and they see it bounced around a lot, but they don't quite know what it is, I think we've done a good job here. Hopefully it's cleared that up a little bit. And if you haven't thought about buying a first focal plane, maybe this will put the bug in your head to think about it.
I would say that if you're on the fence on whether or not you need a first focal plane or a second focal plane, or if you think your second focal plane is somehow outdated, or if the guy at your gun club is trying to talk you out of a first focal plane, fit it to your application. If you've got a question about it, just give us a call. We're fortunate enough. We do a lot of shooting and hunting. I think we can probably lend some decent advice as to where a first focal plane would certainly be advantageous, or where you can save some time, save some money, and go with a second focal plane and be just as happy. So, yeah, suit it to application.
What's the number here?
1-800-426-0048. We're here for you all the time.
Perfect. Good last call. Mark, you want? How about you close it out? I'll do my last call.
Well, because you have an additional thing. So
True. Well, mine's not going to be an addition. Mine's going to precursor probably what will be another podcast, I think. So
part of my last call is a tip to go earlier in the last call section, because Ryan and Paul really took a conglomeration of what I was thinking. But I think they nailed it. People want to put things into buckets, right? Like A is better than B, and have it be like this absolute thing. And we even to almost have a similar question. Somebody will say, well, what's the best scope for my AR? It's like, well, how do you intend to use it? And I think that's one of the big takeaways is how do you intend to use it? And that'll dictate, essentially which optical system, first or second is going to be the best one for you. So
right. It can start steering you down that path of narrowing it into what's best for you. Absolutely.
For sure.
So that's what I got.
Okay. My last call is, so like you guys said, first focal plane, second focal plane, application based, all that good stuff. I totally agree with it, but I won't say it again just because everyone's heard it. One thing that I know we didn't get to that some people might be wondering, we started talking about some lower powers, but there is a type of scope, low power variable, 1 to 6, 1 to 8, 1 to 4s, that kind of thing that people have asked, about first focal plane, second focal plane. There is a whole talk worth of thoughts on those. Times where, or applications where, or scopes even, just individual scopes where second focal plane and first focal plane might make sense. That is something that I think would be a really good podcast to do in the future and talk about, because
that one might go on for a little while.
It could go on for a while, and I think that there is some application for like a first focal plane 1 to something. I'm not going to deny the fact that there is some application for it. That said, I think that there is a huge myth out there that it is the way to go and it's the only way to do low power variables, or if you don't have first focal plane, you're missing something with your low power variable. But we'll leave that for a whole nother talk. So that's my last call.
Awesome. I'd say that's a wrap.
That's a wrap.
Right.
We're still working on after the last call what we say. So for now, we just kind of go with like bye.
I think that'll work.
Until next time.
It's been working for years.
It has. So from all of us, bye.
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 Goodbye.
All right, that'll wrap it up for this episode of the Vortex Nation podcast. Thanks everybody for listening. Hit that subscribe button so you can always stay up to date on the latest happenings over here at the Vortex Nation podcast. Leave us a review or comment down below. We want to hear what you have to say about the show. Maybe what you like, maybe what you didn't like, so that way we can make these podcasts as good as they can be. Hey, if you were interested in some of the information you heard here too, but you don't want to go all the way back and listen to the whole thing again just to get out one little nugget of information, check out the link in the description, because we'll have this in PDF form with pretty much everything that we've talked about You can also follow us on Instagram at Vortex Nation Podcast. We'll be posting about each episode released, so that way you can go back, find these things, maybe grab a little nugget of information that you could take with you to the range, out in the field, or maybe to the kitchen if we're talking about some good food. So, again, everybody, thanks, and happy hunting and shooting. We appreciate it. Have a good one.